annexation involves one state taking over another wholesale and incorporating it into its own territory.
Annexation takes the powers away from the government of the sovereign state. It essentially supplants the decision-making powers of the government of the state with the government of another state.
It can occur in two different ways. One is consensual. One state agrees to be taken over by another state. We would call that annexation. And non-consensual, when one state uses military force to physically occupy and take over a state and make it part of its own.
There also seems to be a rather murky third option, but we'll get to that in a bit. First, let's take a look at invasion, which is usually what everyone associates with annexation.
Well, you can annex the way Putin has annexed Crimea, which is to march in and take it over with force. You can annex the way he wants to annex the remainder of Ukraine through essentially a full-on shooting war.
But invasions occur for a whole host of other reasons. And there are instances you could imagine where one state invades another, not necessarily to annex that state, but ends up annexing it in the end. Or it invades in order to occupy oil fields or some other resource, but not necessarily annexation. So annexation and invasion can go together, but they aren't necessarily always linked.
But what about the consensual version?
If there's one state that says, yeah, it's our desire, we've had a referendum, we've had an election, state X has a desire to join state Y, and you go through all these various procedures, then the annexation can occur, and as long as the international community, generally through the mechanism of the United Nations, accepts it, then that's okay.
So if there's two main categories, consensual and non-consensual, what about the trade war we find ourselves in? Could a trade war ever be a form of annexation?
You can annex politically by offering the population a choice, or you can annex by forcing the surrender of a nation through economic pressure or negotiation. Economic force would be trying to starve a country economically, whether it's through blockade or, as Trump has said he would do, through the imposition of harsh tariffs, choking the economy.
The use of tariffs and the economic mechanisms that the U.S. administration is using at the moment against Canada, but also other states, that can be seen as a kind of harassment and weakening technique. So if we accept the premise that it's possible that the United States has in mind to annex Canada, it might be using tariffs and other kinds of economic measures to weaken the government of Canada sufficiently that when it makes the next move to, let's say, annex Canada, the government might say, yeah, okay, we're tired of the harassment, the pressure, the economic implications of what you are doing, and we'll accept the annexation.
And that's the murky part. International law says you can't use force to take over another country, but it's silent on whether that includes economic force. But this tactic of starving a country economically could be seen as interfering with a country's sovereignty, which is illegal.
In 1945, following World War II, when the legal paradigm essentially became sovereignty and territorial integrity of a state, and that is reflected in the United Nations Charter and its purposes and principles, Articles 1 and 2, and Article 2.4 expressly prohibits the interference with the sovereignty and territorial integrity of a state. Now, interference with sovereignty can take many forms. It can take force. It can take undermining a government. The definition of force, I think, to some extent at international law is shifting and becoming more malleable. What you are looking at, however, in the Trump context, for example, the tariffs are a coercive measure in the sense that they are in direct breach of a lawfully negotiated, accepted, and implemented trilateral trade agreement that Trump himself negotiated. So he's essentially breaching a treaty that he negotiated in order to impose tariffs on Canada for the purpose of draining us economically so that ultimately we would be prepared to surrender our sovereignty.
Canada is going to be a very serious contender to be our 51st state. They should be the 51st state. Let it become a state. I'd like to see Canada become our 51st state.
So at the end of the day, when is annexing illegal?
International law about annexation is quite straightforward. It's illegal. except if it's consensual. But any other form of annexation is fundamentally illegal. So the economic measures that are being used at the moment are seen in that category. What are these economic measures? How does international law deal with them as economic measures? International law doesn't necessarily look at them as a prelude to something else. And so the connection isn't direct there until the added layer of the government, let's say the US government in this instance, makes that next move and says, by the way, you can ease this economic pressure if you allow us to take you over.
Okay, so who gets to decide whether it's an illegal annexation? Well, this is complicated. The International Court makes a decision, and then the matter goes to the UN Security Council, which is the UN's enforcement arm, to take an action.
Of course, whenever you have a legally binding decision by the UN Security Council, the permanent 5 members, China, Russia, US, France, and the UK, get a veto. So I wouldn't hold my breath. There are provisions, of course, within the UN Charter if the Security Council doesn't do a thing when it is supposed to do. The General Assembly can act. Of course, decisions by the General Assembly are not legally binding, but they can reflect customary international law if enough states sign on from all the world regions.
With all of that said, can we tell if Canada is on the brink of annexation?
If we look back and look at examples of annexation over time, and you look at the states in question, part of what we're looking at is that lead up to annexation. Were there signs? Did the receiving state, if we want to call it that, know what was coming? I think given what we've seen so far on the part of the United States, the messaging is your crucial first clue. The number of consistent messages about Canada as the 51st state that have come from not just the president but other high-level officials is an indicator that either they're serious about that or they're using that in a very serious way to gain something else, and we don't know what the something else is yet. So in the meantime, we have to take that signaling as being what it says it is, a determination, a desire to annex Canada as the 51st state.
Which Trump has been saying a lot of. So when will the threat of annexation be over?
I think the immediate threat will pass when Trump is out of office, but the difficulty is predicting when that will be.
I think one of the things we'd be looking for is fewer mentions of Canada as the 51st state, fewer efforts to diminish our legitimacy and the legitimacy of the government of Canada. If we get a different kind of administration after another election in the US and a different approach, then I imagine we'll see that the danger is past.
And the American political system is very far beyond our control. So how concerned should we be?
I think it's very serious. I'm not sure that I can at this moment envisage a full-scale military invasion of Canada. But I think it's pretty clear, regardless of whether that's on the table or not, that the Trump administration wants to weaken us for whatever reason.
Canadians need to be aware that this is an external threat, which means it needs to unite us as Canadians.
If you don't take it seriously, then it's possible that even if it wasn't intended in the first place to be a prelude to annexation, it might become one. You have to push back strong, you have to push back right away.